for what's called Adobe Max. And it's a creative conference in LA, and typically it's held in person, and there's 10 to 20,000 creative professionals there. Everything from people who create films, motion pictures, to great artists and photographers and people in audio and all backgrounds of people who create. Well, this year, and obviously we're able to do it in person at the LA Auditorium, and so they offer classes online for free. Which is great, because normally, they would send 2 of us down to LA every year, and it's $5,000 to $10,000 per person between airfare and accommodations and the facilities themselves and dining and all that. So this year I was able to take classes, and this is learning from experience. So the great thing about Adobe Max and these classes is that you learn from the masters. I mean, not only do you learn the Adobe products, you guys have all heard of Photoshop, but there's also InDesign, Illustrator, and Premiere, and there's a whole suite of software that you can use to create different artworks, motion and stills and whatnot. But you go and you learn from the people, that created the software, so they know where all the buttons are, but you also learn from the people who create amazing artwork with these. Andy Lepkowitz was there, who does great photography. I learned, one of my classes was how to create a character. So just creating, in our case, he wanted us to create a space monkey who was mind-controlled and had a jetpack. And so he's like, so if you're given that brief, how do you create a character out of that? And this guy was actually, he works for Disney, and that's where he is for a living. He's a professor at BYU, and he works for Disney, and they just say, we're creating this animated film, and we want a character that does this. And he draws it. And so while he's there explaining what all the shapes mean, he's like, oh, and you use a circle for this, and if you use jagged lines, it means this, and he evokes this, and he's doing, he has 5 things, and I drawn a circle. But one of the best ways to learn is to examine the life of somebody who does it well. So this is a great opportunity for us in the creative area and who do artwork and creative stuff for a living to learn from the best. If you want to be a great investor, you study the life of Warren Buffett. If you want to learn business, you read about someone like Richard Branson or Jeff Bezos. If you want to be a great writer, read biographies or memoirs of Whitman or Dickens. And if you want to be a great artist, you take classes like those that I took. It's interesting, the gift you guys gave me, I really appreciate it. I don't know how you knew, but when I was done with one of my classes this last week, I was taking a class on photography touch-up. And he was going really in-depth into this, but it ended a little bit early. And so I went back to the homepage for Adobe Max to see what other courses are happening right now. I have a few extra minutes that I can take while I'm waiting for my next class to start. And I'm scrolling through, and Stanley Tucci pops up, and I'm like, oh, I can take a class from the actor Stanley Tucci. This is pretty cool. And I log in, and he comes up on the screen, and he teaches me how to make an old-fashioned. And so I tell my wife this later that afternoon, of course, and she's like, oh, you should be the master. You should make us old-fashions. And we had no bourbon. So this is perfect. Now that I know how to make them, now I have the wherewithal to do this. So through this sermon, I brought back, or I scrounged some artwork from some of the people that I learned from. And so I thought that you would enjoy some of these as we go through. We will have scripture reads up on the projector, and then also some artwork from some of the people that I learned from. Because learning from experience obviously isn't only applicable to graphic design. It also applies to sharing the gospel. If we want to learn how to make a difference in people's lives spiritually, we need to look at the life of someone who's done so. So today we're going to look at a case study of someone who evangelized effectively, helped plant some of the first churches. And this case study we're going to learn about from examples on how to be a better evangelist. And not just a list of rules but actually how he went forward to accomplish what he did. This man, of course, was Paul. Paul, who hated Jesus and Christianity from the very beginning, who was a Jew of Jews and wanted to wipe the planet clear of this heresy. But after an encounter with Jesus, he had his life completely transformed. He became one of the greatest evangelists the church has ever known. He traveled all throughout the Roman Empire, starting churches and sharing the good news of Jesus. One of the cities he visited early on was Thessalonica. It's a Greece city, and he went there. It was essentially looking for him. It was well over 100,000 people, so a very large metropolitan area at the time. And it had all sorts of religions here. So they brought in all religions of Thessalonica, and people worshipped many gods here. You can start in the book of Acts, and we read about Paul's time in Thessalonica. He first went there to the Jewish synagogue, and for 3 weekends he shared the gospel. During the week, he worked his trade making tents to support himself, because just like now, pastoral ministry doesn't pay. Some believed him, but some hated his message, and they started a riot. We don't know how long he ended up staying in Thessalonica, but the opposition cut his time shorter than he wanted. But while he was in Thessalonica, he founded an important church there. And even though he couldn't stay, he was concerned about this church that he planted. He wanted to make sure it grew up right and that it was doing well. So he sent his associate Timothy to see how the church was doing. And he received a mostly positive report. They weren't doing too bad. So as a follow-up, he writes 1 Thessalonians to encourage them and to deal with a few issues in their church. This writing shows us a window into what an effective evangelistic ministry can look like. As Paul recounts his trip to Thessalonica, we see from his example how the gospel must be declared. So Paul's ministry in Thessalonica had at least 3 characteristics that we can emulate. Here are 3 ways we can learn to be more effective in sharing the gospel in our daily lives. The first one is found in verses 1 through 2 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. And it's share the gospel boldly, even when it's hard. So Paul writes, "For you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though he had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict." Here's the first way that Paul shared the gospel. He was bold, even when it was hard. And Paul says, our coming to you was not in vain. It served a purpose. But here he begins to list the problems that he had at Philippi as well as in Thessalonica. Here's a short list. In Philippi, according to Acts chapter 16, he and his co-worker Silas were insulted, attacked by a mob, publicly stripped, beaten by rods with many blows. They were thrown into prison, had their feet put in stocks. All of this, of course, violating their rights as Roman citizens, adding insult to injury. I like to think that we pivoted fairly well with the difficulties we've had in this year with ministry. I have a friend of mine who actually is a worship minister at a local church in Eugene. And they've had difficulties with people just stopped coming, or some people moved away, or some people don't appreciate wearing masks and so won't come. I won't attend church as long as I have a mask on my face. But our church attendance has been fairly well, and we didn't miss a step. We immediately turned it into something that we could do with the digital means that we had, and then as soon as we could open with precautions, we did so. Even so, none of us pastors were publicly stripped, or beaten, or thrown into prison, or any of those things as far as I know. So this all led up to them before they got to Thessalonica. So we showed up, they were probably in pain from the beating, in pain because of persecution. And so he goes in already down in his luck, and with a short time they encounter more strong opposition. Some people started a riot. Some people went looking for Paul and his friends, and they had to flee the city in the cover of darkness. So they're leaving Thessalonica, and Paul and Silas are sore and tired, frustrated. Probably turned to Silas and said, you know what? Maybe we should give this whole racket up. I'm a decent tent maker, you know. Maybe I can build a better tent. Maybe I can move into backpacks. This is hard work. But even though that's may have been what his head said, his heart said that he had to keep going. Paul says we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. When we learn from Paul's example, we will share the gospel boldly, even when it's difficult. Because boldness is a prerequisite for the results that Paul experienced. If he hadn't been bold, then the Thessalonians wouldn't have even heard the gospel. If he hadn't been bold, his life would not have been fruitful. All the things that Paul lists in this passage, the approval of God, the close relationship he had with the Thessalonians, wouldn't have come true. If we're going to be fruitful, we're going to have to learn to be bold, even when it's hard. But what's the source of our boldness? Where did Paul get his boldness? He actually tells us in verse 2, he says, we have boldness in our God. It wasn't boldness in himself, he wasn't cocky of himself. It was the rock-solid confidence that, as John Piper wrote, God was so real and so powerful and so wise and so utterly committed to doing all for Paul's good that he knew nothing could separate him from the love of God. I know in my life that's the missing piece. When it gets hard, I don't have the boldness always to keep going. When there's opposition, and I'm not even talking about Paul's opposition, but the opposition we have, it's so much easier to say, maybe we don't do church this week. Maybe we just cancel it. It's too difficult to put up a video. It's too difficult to send out an email. They can find there's other sources out there. There's lots of YouTube videos. It's so easy to say, I don't have to do anything. God can work without me. But that's not the way to get things done. We don't want to upset people. We don't want to cause a scene. Really, we like to be comfortable. We all do. We like human approval and praise. We like money and comfort. We don't like putting our neck out and possibly getting hurt. And that's why we don't speak up sometimes. Someone once said, so at least these two things have to happen inside if we are to be bold. We have to get free from the need of human acceptance and praise, and we have to get free from the need of the comforts and securities that money can buy. If we are free, we will be bold. Paul had his approval from God. We do not need human approval. He had his future in God, so no human threats could stop his courage. I often seek human approval and become depressed when it's not there. This last week was pretty light, which was nice because I was able to take classes, but I still presented some logo designs and some website designs to people in Canada, to people over in North Carolina, to people all over. And it's hard when you spend hours on a design and you put it out there, and they say, you know what, we're going to go a different direction. You know what, that's not quite the right look for us. It was really hard. I was presenting to a company in Canada, and my web design came up for the website, and it was like, oh, that's a great web design, it's so good, it encapsulates everything we wanted in our website, and you've kind of condensed it so people can use it really well. And so then the next guy comes up, and I hadn't seen his, so we often pitch several different designs from several different designers, so that they get different aspects and so that they can choose which one they like the best. And so he gets up and his flashed on the screen and he says, well, I had the advantage of actually seeing Aleck's design before I started mine, so I started with Aleck's design and I just improved upon it and polished it. And I'm sitting there like, thanks, Evan. And of course, they picked it slow. And so I'm down in the dumps. I'm looking out for approval. I'm looking down, and I'm looking inward, and I'm getting depressed. Because the key to boldness is not looking to others, not looking inward, not looking to our own merit, but the key to boldness is looking to God more than we look to our need for human approval and comfort. Ultimately, the best approval and comfort comes from God anyways. If our lives aren't going to be in vain, and we're going to be fruitful and effective, we're going to need a boldness in God, even when it's difficult. Here are a couple of ways we can cultivate that boldness. Ask God for it. He's the source of all, right? He's the source of mercy. He's the source of love. He's the source of boldness. Pray for it. After all, Paul asked others to pray that he would declare the gospel boldly as I ought to speak in Ephesians 6. Pray for boldness. Ask others to pray for boldness in your life. Boldness isn't a personality trait. It's not a genetic marker. It's grown as we look to God and prize Him more than anything else. And every time you're not bold, try to figure out what happened. Figure out what you are trusting in that moment more than God. For me, it was human approval. For me, it was my own abilities that I thought were failing. Confess it to God and to others and ask God for help in overcoming that block. That's the first way we can learn to be more effective at sharing the gospel, with boldness in God. Remember, he wasn't bold in himself. He wasn't bold because others told him that he was, or that he knew he could charm the people in Thessalonica. He had boldness knowing who God was and knowing that God was back. Here's another way we can learn to be more effective at sharing the gospel. Share the gospel honestly, which pleases God. This is verses 3 through 6 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. In these verses, Paul writes, "For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God, who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is our witness. Nor do we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ." We see in this passage that motive is a big deal. Verse 3 focuses on 3 ways that he tried to weave honesty into his life and ministry. The first was his message, the actual words that he spoke. His message was true. It does not appeal. Our appeal does not spring from error, whether error of their spoken word or error of the PowerPoint that he always took with him. I would have liked to have, Paul's PowerPoint clicker. That would have been some doohickey. His motives were also above board. His appeal didn't spring from impurity. This is a word that's used for something that's so immoral it's dirty. In this context, he was talking about not being seen with the really bad people, not taking bribes, no financial gain, no people pleasing. He wasn't pandering to the crowd. And his third method that we know would keep him upstanding as a person so that people would believe his integrity or his methods. His message was true, his motives were above board, and his methods were honest. He says that he avoided any attempt to deceive. He didn't use underhanded rhetorical tricks that would have manipulated his audience. He didn't build up his audience and then have a call for everyone to accept the Lord. He didn't bring in a flashy worship leader to play upon their emotions. He just spoke the truth. Paul lived so that his whole life and ministry were above board. People can make whatever accusation they wanted against him, but it sure would have been difficult to say much about his integrity. And this is so important because we live in a world of fakes now more than ever. Many products are designed to imitate the real thing. There's plastic decking that looks like real wood, vinyl flooring that appears to be ceramic. You can purchase fake fur, or jewelry, phony noses, hair pieces, etc. At Adobe, they introduced just now in Photoshop an ability to change how people appear to feel in photos. So now you can actually take a photograph, and with a simple slider, you can make them happy, or you can make them angry. You can change the direction they are looking. You can age them 50 years up or back. The back one's kind of fun, the forward. I don't recommend. I don't look good at 90 apparently. All so easy that anybody has access to it. At first, I thought the entire spiel was a fake. They had Conan O'Brien, who was the host of the event, and they took a picture of him and they changed it. They had him have less hair and more hair. And they made him smile really big, and then they made him frown. All with a single photograph. But then I tried it myself. And I brought my family in. I'm like, oh, look at this picture of me. I'm like, Dad, that's creepy. Okay. But everybody knows to fake a photograph, you Photoshop a photograph, right? Oh, you weren't at the Eiffel Tower. That was clearly Photoshopped. It's become its own word. And it's such a problem that Adobe, along with creating even more ways to fake a smile, have now created software where you can track the authenticity of a photo all the way through. From the time somebody captures the photo, you know that's the real thing. And by the time that I'm done fiddling with it at the end of the line, doing graphic design for a poster, you can actually track where it went and you can see what the original photo looked like. So now there's software even to combat that because everybody loves to fake, right? You know, if I can take 20 years off my life and get a big old fake smile and put it out there, it's going to be much more appealing than the raw image. We can learn a lot from Paul. When we are real and our lives match the message, we'll be a lot more effective in sharing the gospel. When people look at our lives, they have to see that our lives match the message of the gospel. It's like that tracking marker. People can tell. People can see whether you're authentic or not. This doesn't mean that we're perfect, but it does mean that we're pursuing integrity and that we repent when we fall short. Paul's message, motives, and methods were all above board. And we can learn to share the gospel honestly, like he did. So we've been trying to learn from Paul's example. We've learned that we can be more effective in sharing the gospel by being bold and honest. But there's one more way we can learn to be more effective in sharing the gospel. Share the gospel lovingly through our lives as well as our words. We're going to continue in verses 7 through 12. And here Paul writes, "But we are gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So, being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers and sisters, our labor and our toil. We worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you. While we proclaim to you the gospel of God, you are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Now, it would have been easy to stop with our first two, to be bold and above board, and you will go far with those two items. But we'd be missing a key ingredient to take it all away, which is found in verse 8. We were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves. We're not just sharing the gospel, we're sharing ourselves. We're opening up our lives to people. I know I open my life to a lot of people, mostly because it seems like it's needed, and sometimes there's not enough people to go around, so I'll step in. But with scouting, we could do Zoom meetings, we could send out videos how to start a fire. We could send out things about how to be above board and how to be an upright, God-fearing American boy. But that doesn't teach them. Going on these campouts, spending time with them. One of the first things most of the scouts do is they learn to start a fire. And they learn to start a fire without matches, right? Without anything fancy. They can do any method that's not a match or a lighter, but usually they use flint and steel. And so I got up early last Saturday morning, and it was cold, and I collected stuff, and I thought, you know what, nobody's up, and it's late, I should just start this fire. I'm like, no, I won't teach them anything. So we got up some of the younger scouts. These are kids that are in like the 6th grade. And we had the older scouts teach the younger scouts. We said, go ahead and learn to start this fire. And we sat there for an hour. And we shivered. And yet, they would not give up. And the requirement is actually to start a fire with just like a flint and steel, and then to keep it alive for 5 minutes. And so they all lit the fire. They were so happy. They caught a spark and they got up, but none of them could keep up for 5 minutes. So after an hour, we had 5 minutes. It was like 5 minutes and 3 seconds, and it went out. And we're like, okay, good boys, step aside. And then the scoutmasters stepped in, and we built a big roaring fire. But it means everything to them that we were there. My scoutmaster, he actually became Scoutmaster of the Year this year. And he had a kid who eagled out. So he's already 18, his kid is out of the program, he no longer comes, and yet Scott still shows up every week and every camp out and is there for these kids because he's sharing his life with them. And that means everything. In order to get Scoutmaster of the Quarter, you have to have letters written in to the office of the boys who you served, of the people who you shared your life with. And it meant so much to them that he shared his life, that he got this great honor. Because when COVID hit, we could have packed it up and said, Scouts is done. We could have packed up church and said, find us somewhere else. We'll come back when everything's good, but we didn't. We moved on. We found new ways to do things. We found ways to connect, to share lives with people. John MacArthur once said, you are the only Bible some unbelievers will ever read. Some of these boys that I deal with aren't believers at all. In fact, coming in, we often get the question of, So I know that the oath and law is to God, and there's a big section of Boy Scouts that's worshiping God and doing your duty to God. I'm an unbeliever, what do I do? You say, well, we won't push it on you. There will be praying. There will be duty to God. But just come, try it out. And inevitably, those boys are the most changed. They're not changed by the words in their books. They're changed by the lives that we share with them. It is challenging. It's easy to hand out literature, give somebody a good book, or the good book. It's easy to hang banners and run Facebook ads and create brochures. And all of these are good, but they're not even close to being equal as sharing ourselves with other people. You have not shared the gospel when you've just shared information. It involves so much more. Look at the language that Paul uses, like a nursing mother working day and night. Like a father with his children. Think about what this would have looked like. Think about what it looks like now. Those of us who have kids or who do any ministry, work full time, then come home. Do you get to just sit down and watch TV? No. You're prepping for the next thing. You have another meeting or a sermon to prepare. Or somebody who wants your time to, in my case, fix the computer or go to their house and feed their cat. There's always something. It would have involved patience on Paul's part, as it does with us. Nurturing, encouraging, comforting, exhorting. It would have involved being an example. Because the do as I say, not as I do approach never works. People see right through that. It would have been hard work. It's much more than information, it's sharing our whole lives. When I think about the people who've impacted my life the most, I think of people who gave me much more than a message. They gave me their lives. The two people who have impacted me the most gave me my life. They were not like a nursing mother or an approximation of a father with his children, but they rather were my mother and my father. I can tell, and all kids know, what is real and what is fake. We didn't go to church on Saturday and pretend to be nice and talk with everyone and then go home and curse them behind their backs. They lived their convictions, they lived their faith day in and day out. And it showed. I knew that it was real for them. I knew that they weren't faking it for any sort of gain. They lost jobs. They lost money and friends and family, all for what they thought was right. And they lived those words. And I knew that they lived those words when I would go off to weird places like New York City. And I'd go to a church there. And people who I'd never seen in my life would look at me and say, "You're one of Eugene's kids, aren't you?" I'd be like, "What the? I'm 3,000 miles away from home, and I'm a 12-year-old boy. How do you know my dad?" And they knew my dad because they met him at some festival. And because my dad shared his life with them, even these strangers who we had met once or twice, they remembered him. And thus they treated me like family. Where gospel flourishes, people share their own souls. So what does effective gospel ministry look like? Sometimes we think it would take someone who's more gifted or skilled than we are. And that certainly wouldn't hurt. There's certainly more skilled designers and preachers and ministry workers than those of us in this room. But you know what? They're not here. They're not sharing their lives with you week in and week out. When we look at Paul's life, We see that some of the traits that made him effective are traits that God can grow in anyone. If you hear nothing else, I want you to hear this. Share the gospel boldly, honestly, and lovingly. When we see how much grace God has lavished on us, and what Jesus has done for us through his life, death, and resurrection, when we see how he desires to work with us by the power of the Spirit, how could we not respond with boldness, integrity, and love, sharing the life that he gave to us? And let us pray. Lord, thank you so much for our lives, for your life that you happily sacrificed for us. Thank you for being our daddy, for encompassing us in your family. And thank you for the love that you share, not just with us, but you allow us to share with everyone else. We thank you for that ability to share, that ability to be